Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Gladys Mitchell-Walthour, who is an associate professor of public policy and political economy in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. She specializes in Afro-Brazilian political behavior, Black racial identity, discrimination, affirmative action, and the Bolsa Familia program in Brazil. She served as the president of the Brazilian Studies Association from 2018 to 2020, and is currently the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, as well as a member of the board of directors of the Washington, Brazil office. She is the author of the Politics of Blackness, Racial Identity and Political Behavior in Contemporary Brazil, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Her work has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Latin American Politics and Society, Politics, Groups, and Identities, and the National Political Science Review. Gladys, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you. I am so happy to be here today, Jim. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So March 14th will mark the 4th anniversary of the assassination of Marielle Franco. Who was she and why does she continue to be an international symbol, sparking commemorations of the anniversary of her assassination worldwide?
Marielle Franco was an Afro-Brazilian politician, activist who fought for the rights of Black people, Black women, young people, low-income people, youth, LGBTQ plus people. You know, we could go on and on. So she was a really important person in the struggle for Black rights. She stood up against the repression of Black people in communities, especially repression by police. And I think that is also one of the reasons that people connect so much with her throughout the world, but especially just thinking about Black people throughout the world. Due to what she stood for and what she fought against, people really connect with her. And this is why people continue to celebrate her legacy.
So could you tell our listening audience a little bit about what happened to her? How was she assassinated? What was the story there?
So Marielle Franco was extremely important due to being a city council person in Rio. But she was also this politician a politician and activist who was very well known, who stood up against the police. She was killed on March 14, 2018. And this was largely due to her being so visible and also speaking out against the police repression of favela communities, communities such as Mare, where she was from, and other favela communities throughout Rio. She was extremely outspoken, and so many people believe this is why she was a target.
So so she was killed in March of 18, and Bolsonaro was elected president in October of 2018. What have been the policies of the Bolsonaro government since he come to power?
I think the policies of the Bolsonaro government has been largely one of ignoring the rights of marginalized communities, but also legislation or policies such as the tough on crime type of stance he took as he ran for office. Those type of policy stances have been detrimental to Afro-Brazilian communities, and people have mobilized against that. In terms of what we're thinking about today, I think the way that he has not responded to the pandemic has also had a huge impact on marginalized communities, including Afro-Brazilians. So very much like the United States, where Afro descendants have been more negatively impacted in terms of having a higher rate of death due to COVID-19. Something similar has happened in Brazil, where Afro-Brazilians have a higher propensity of dying compared to white Brazilians. And he really hasn't taken a serious stance on fighting the pandemic. He still has not been vaccinated. He refuses to wear a mask. He still promotes conspiracy theories And these things have had a huge impact, a huge negative impact on Afro-Brazilians.
So as many of our listeners will know, slavery was abolished in Brazil in 1888. It was the last country in the Americas to end the institution. While less than 1 million Africans were forcibly moved across the Atlantic and ended up in the United States, approximately 5 million enslaved Africans survived the Middle Passage, that horrible transition from Africa to the Americas, and ended up in Brazil. So what have been the legacies of the enslavement of Africans in Brazil today? What's the status of people of African descent in Brazil?
I think it's an excellent point that you brought up, Jim. And this is often something that I point out to U.S. audiences, because a lot of times people assume that most Africans were brought to the United States, which we know, in fact, when we compare Brazil to the U.S., Brazil received a much larger number of Africans than we did here in the United States. I think in terms of the legacy is that you have a lot of inequality. And so it's important for us to talk about the impact of slavery, but also the ongoing efforts to continue that legacy of slavery, which is what you can see throughout the country. And of course, there have been advances, but when you look at things such as unemployment, when you look at poverty rates, when you look at education or educational attainment, all of these things reflect a legacy of marginalizing Afro descendants in Brazil, with Afro-Brazilians being on the bottom when compared to white Brazilians.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that Marielle Franco represented was the empowerment of Black women to be engaged in formal politics as well as being leaders in social movements and community activism. So what has been the actual role of Black women in politics in Brazil?
This is an excellent question. And I've really been looking more at this in one of my my second projects, but close to my conclusion of the book. And really after Marielle was assassinated, of course, it was a horrible situation, but Afro-Brazilian women, which they have always, been served as activists, grassroots activists, kind of informal leaders, even when they're not acknowledged or recognized as leaders. So they've always been doing that work, but people have been committed to not being silenced. And they've said, even though you tried to silence Marielle Franco, you as in the Brazilian state or those in power, they continue to say that we will not be silenced. And so it really inspired a number of Afro-Brazilian women to run for political office. So even for those, many did not win, because it's still very difficult to be elected to office in Brazil. You still have to have a number of resources. They don't have the same kind of connections as other politicians who maybe had a grandfather or a great-grandfather who, ran for office and held office for a long time. So they have that name recognition. But still, people are still very much engaged in politics. And for me, what is important is that people feel like that they should be a part of politics. So winning is important, but also having people to be politically engaged so that they are making certain demands on the state, I think is also important. And it's, really that is one of the results of Marielle Franco's assassination, as well as I just also want to mention that her sister, Anielle Franco, has just done a tremendous job and an excellent job at really making sure that people continue to push for all of those things that her sister pushed for. And she's been making just so many connections with people throughout the world with the Marielle Franco Institute. They're conducting their own research. So she's continuing that legacy and also supporting other Afro-Brazilian women to run for office.
In fact, we're very honored that the Washington, Brazil office has that the Instituto Marielle Franco, the Marielle Franco Institute, is a part of the Washington, Brazil office, is one of our affiliate social movements in Brazil. So when I lived in Brazil in the 70s and studied at the University of Sao Paulo, it was really notably the absence of Afro-Brazilian students. The structure of the universities required passing an entrance exam. People who went to public schools had less of an advantage, and most of the kids who went to the university were people who came from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds, and their parents invested in private high schools to prepare them for the entrance exam. And that really changed, and it's really a notable change. It started slowly under the government of Fernando Cardoso when he initiated some affirmative action programs in the Ministry of Foreign Relations, but really picked up under the Lula and the Dilma Rousseff administrations, where there has actually been a situation where by law, 50% of the students going to the public universities, which are free, had to be of African or indigenous descent or low income. What has been the effect of that program, which has been in effect in different manifestations over the last 10 years on Brazilian society?
It's a great question. It has really had a tremendous effect, right, on increasing the number of Afro-Brazilian students. So, just like you mentioned earlier, it was rare to see Afro-Brazilian students on campus. But then with the introduction of affirmative action policies, first both in public and private universities, but then actually signing this legislation, which President Dilma Rousseff actually signed, which goes up for renewal actually this year in 2022, there has been a huge increase. And there have been some studies, saying that now the public universities are now majority Afro-Brazilian. Now, there are other researchers, such as Salas Santos, who actually questions those numbers, because when you actually go into certain fields, such as medicine or engineering, on paper, it may say that you have Afro-Brazilians, but then when you actually look, you may not actually have any. So there are some people, who question the numbers, because there are students who commit fraud. But in general, there has been a huge increase. And I think, of course, that this is something very positive. But I think we also, just kind of thinking ahead, which people are doing this, is that we also have to consider and advocate for affirmative action in employment. The hard thing is to have the affirmative action in private employment. But really, when you, again, kind of similar to the United States, when you look at the rate of unemployment of college graduates, of Afro-Brazilian college graduates compared to white college graduates, the rate of unemployment is still higher for Afro-Brazilian students. And of course, just the legacy of Brazil is to say, this is different now. But the legacy is to say, oh, well, discrimination is based on class. That's because people didn't have enough education. But now we're looking at students who have the same education, but Afro-Brazilians are still facing barriers to employment, which is due to skin color discrimination.
So you raise a very important question here, because as you know so well, historically, racial segregation in the United States was based on the one-drop rule, that if you had any African ancestry, you were considered Black. And for centuries in Brazil, skin color and tonality of skin in part determined one's socioeconomic status. And if you were of mixed race background, you had more possibilities of rising in society over those of stronger African descent, although it's very complex. It's a very simplification of a social phenomena, historical phenomenon. Now, that identity model changed. And I, again, lived in Brazil as I saw that transforming. And today, according to census, people of mixed descent and of African descent, pure African descent, in the census are over a majority. They're over 50% in the population. Although some people in Brazil would say, well, light-skinned people aren't really Black, they're pardo or they're mixed racial background. But that's really changed. Why do you think that change took place in Brazil?
Yeah, I think a lot of that took or this change that we're talking about is really due to Black movement activism, right? So for a very long time, activists have really advocated for Afro-Brazilians to accept their African identity. The hard thing, of course, in Brazil is that everyone accepts their African identity, including whites, right? So everyone will say, oh, I have a Black great grandmother, or I have a Black, great grandmother. And then in general, the country embraces its African roots. So very different from the United States, where of course we also have whites with African ancestry, but people aren't going to claim that ancestry. But part of the Brazilian identity is to say, we have African roots, we have European roots, and we have indigenous roots. So that really made it complicated for Black activists to then to kind of separate the national identity from a Black identity. However, people did advocate and continue to push for acceptance of a Black identity, and that that's through a number of ways. People do it through direct activism. What I see today on social media, but also pre-COVID, people also had marches and workshops where they talked about accepting natural hair. And then they also showed women, different hairstyles in terms of wearing their hair natural. So it was really a push against kind of European notions of what beauty is, right? So I really attribute that change to accepting whether it's a Black identity in terms of saying that one is preto, or this kind of umbrella category of negro, or even people, saying that they're pardo, but that's still acknowledging a type of African ancestry. I attribute that to Black activists.
So Gladys, how did you get involved in Brazil? What's the story that brought you from North Carolina to Brazil?
So I really have to say that was due to my experience as an undergraduate. I was already interested in Latin America. I went to Duke University for undergrad. So I was fortunate to be able to travel to Latin America for free. I went to Mexico, to Honduras, to Costa Rica. All of these were free trips. And I was also able to take classes on Latin America. But when I took my history class, I think it was also history and like a joint class with African American studies or something. But it was a class that John French offered, and it was on Afro-Brazilian history and culture. After that, I was hooked. So I knew that I wanted to study Brazil. I didn't know what I was going to do with Brazil. I didn't know when this was going to happen. And I think I took that class either my second or third year. But after that, I knew, so Latin America was already on my radar, but after that, I knew that Brazil would be the country that I wanted to either do some type of development work in, or some type of activist work. I really didn't have a clue of what it would be as an undergraduate student, but that was really what hooked me.
And what was it about Brazil or the class that John French taught that kind of grabbed you? What was it that you learned in the class? I have that experience with my students. I tell them at the beginning of the class, 5 or 6 of you are going to fall in love with Brazil by the end of the class. And they come in, how did you know? How did you know?
That's great. Yeah, it was really, I really could say everything. So I remember we learned about African-derived religions. I remember we learned about Benedita da Silva. We read, I think it was Medina Benjamin's book. This was a while back, but she had a book about Benedita da Silva. So I learned about, Black women politicians. I learned about religions, culture, the history, all of these things throughout the class. I kept thinking, wow, some of this is a little similar to the United States, but some of it is just so different. It really fascinated me. And so it was really that the thirst for learning more about what was going on in Brazil that really pulled me in.
Wow. And so then you've written a book, a very good book called The Politics of Blackness, Racial Identity and Political Behavior in Contemporary Brazil, published in 2018 by Cambridge. And how did you get into it? So tell us about the book.
Yes. So that book is about Black group identity and really the impact of Black group identity on political behavior or political choice. So during my PhD field work, a lot of my work was survey work, but I also did some in-depth interviews. And I was really interested in this notion of Black linked fate, which is something that people study in the United States. And they're really trying to get at, so scholars such as Michael Dawson and a number of other scholars are really trying to look at, well, why is it that African Americans feel some attachment to other African Americans? And so Dawson really came up with this theory that is due to historical discrimination. I was really interested in whether that exists in Brazil. And if so, why? Dawson's work doesn't have a follow-up survey question to ask why people feel this way. He just theorized that it was due to discrimination. What's different in my study is I do have a follow-up question. So we ask, do you think what happens to, we use the umbrella term negros, do you think what happens to Blacks affects you? So that's the survey question. And then I also have it in in-depth interviews, but it's followed up by, if they say yes, it's followed up by, well, why? And many people talked about discrimination. So for me, this was fascinating that you have two countries, two different histories, but of course, both have a history of slavery. So they both have that legacy. They both have the legacy of continued discrimination, but they both have different national myths, right? So in the US, our myth is if you work hard, you will be successful. In Brazil, their myth was we don't have discrimination because we have a racially mixed population. But I still find that in both countries, people believe what happens to other Blacks affects them largely due to discrimination. And so that was the one big finding. The other finding was I was interested in whether I would find what Dawson also found in his work was, well, okay, if people demonstrate that they do feel a connection to other Blacks, do they also support certain racial policies for the group? And I found evidence. So in Brazil, I considered 3 cities, which was Salvador, Sao Paulo, and Rio. And of course, I know those are all 3 large cities, so I can't generalize for the other cities in Brazil, nor can I really generalize for those cities since, these are relatively small samples, but there are high rates of group identity and those people who have this kind of sense of linked fate, they end up supporting policies such as affirmative action.
So how has that been mixed up with the growth of the evangelical Christians? I know you're a woman of faith, and how does that affected the growth of conservative evangelical Christians? Because we have a very strong, of course, tradition of Protestant Blacks who were very progressive, very much involved in the civil rights movement. Obviously, Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement with many other important ministers, and they remain important. How is that different in Brazil, or what's going on in Brazil?
And that's a great question. And I always get this question when when people discuss my first book. So what I'm doing in the second book, which is under contract with Columbia University Press, that one is actually looking at Black women social welfare beneficiaries and their political opinions. And what I find there is I have some really interesting results. So for both samples, women, so of course we're talking about very low income women, and in some cases, no income, people who have no income. And what I find is in both samples, they tend to be Christian. And not only that, in the Brazilian sample, they first tend to be evangelical, and then second, they tend to be Catholic. In the United States case, most are Baptist, and then that's followed by some other smaller denominations. But the interesting part is that they also tend to support leftist politicians. And they tend to be highly critical of conservative politicians. The reason I think I find this is because I'm really so the project is really, it's taking an intersectional approach. And so we have to think about all of the intersections that we're looking at, right? So the reason I was interested in looking at these issues is that I kept, seeing this, seeing media analysis, but also even in the political science literature, people talking about evangelical voters as those who support conservative politicians, which they do, especially when we're talking about white evangelicals. But what about when you start also considering gender and race and class, and we could go on and on and on. But so the findings are super interesting. And I think when you see the comments these women make about conservative leaders, you would be, really surprised that these are evangelicals making these comments in Brazil. But again, I really think it's due to all of those intersections. And at the time of the research, it was in 2018. So Michel Temer was still in office, but people were highly critical. And then, of course, in the United States, Donald Trump was in office and women were highly critical. The interesting thing was that when they were critical of conservative politicians in the US, they mentioned both kind of race and class related issues, whereas in Brazil, it was solely based on class. I mean, there were some other things. They also talked about more kind of age-related type things when they talked about retirement and things like that. So other identities came in, but no one really criticized Temer based on, saying, oh, he is doing X, Y, Z against the Afro-Brazilian population, for example. My follow-up research will actually be on, of course, opinions of Bolsonaro. And that will also be interesting to see what evangelicals say about him. But I do think it's really interesting that when you start looking at these intersections, you actually get a lot of progressive politics when you listen to the things that women are saying. And again, I'm talking about this group of Afro-Brazilian women social welfare beneficiaries.
And when are you going to be back in Brazil to do the follow-up research?
In May.
Oh, wow.
So very soon.
That's wonderful. Where will you be doing the research? In the same 3 cities?
So this time, I'm mainly going to be in Bahia. But I really want to see what people are saying in smaller cities. I'm always in large cities. The other one, actually the other Bolsa Familia project was in São Luís. So that was the new city that I added on, but it was São Luís, São Paulo, and Salvador. But this time I will exclusively focus on Bahia. So of course we'll do some work in Salvador, but I also really want to just kind of get outside of such a large city to see if I find similar trends or something totally different. Interesting,
really interesting. So in collaboration with the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil, you and Rubia Valente, an assistant professor at the Marx School of Public and International Affairs at Baruch College and City University of New York, have been working on a survey about Brazilians in the United States. Could you tell us about that project?
Yes, I'm really excited about this project and hope that it will be completed with our IRB process very soon. But the project is really about Brazilians living in the United States. And I do have to give credit to you, Jim, for having this great idea to say, wouldn't it be great if we had this national survey? Because a lot of times you get surveys in cities, but really for the entire country, I don't think there's really a large scale survey. So this is going to be just a great resource for both academics and activists, but we have a number of questions. So we are looking at well-being. We're also looking at networks. So in terms of, when you came over, did you know someone? Why did you come over? We also have some questions on politics, some really interesting questions to find out how involved people are in politics in Brazil, like if they are paying attention to politics in Brazil, but also how they are engaged in politics in the United States. So it covers a range of topics, but I think it's going to be a really exciting survey and data set for academics and, like I said, activists to use.
Yeah, when I was in graduate school, I found a copy of Little Brazil by Maxine Margolis in New York at the Strand, and I bought it and read it and was very excited to see her very pioneering study, anthropological study of Brazilians in New York on 46th Street. And she basically generated a field of study. Many people, Brazilians and other people, started following the same path and doing micro studies in different cities. And she eventually read a book about Brazilians around the world, a really amazing book. But this is really exciting because this will be, I think, the first national survey that we have about Brazilians. There are perhaps over 1 million Brazilians in the United States, so it's a significant number of people. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listening audience today about your research, about the situation in Brazil? Oh, I have a question before I end. This is very important. So I forgot to ask this question. So you have a wonderful, bright, young daughter who I met when she was 6 years old, Truth. You homeschooled her while you also are very involved in your professional career at the university, teaching, being part of the Brazilian Studies Association, and you were the past president of the Brazilian Studies Association, and also the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. So why did you decide to get involved with the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil? You have a very successful academic career, you have a family, you have all these responsibilities. I know you are committed to your church as well. Why did you decide to take that extra time to become an activist?
Yeah, so so in terms of, so for my church, I actually attend virtually, and that's Trinity United Church of Christ that I attend virtually, but which promotes very much a Black liberation theology. So that's why I really love that church. But the reason that I'm involved in the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil is really, it allows me to do the type of work that I would be doing if I were not an academic. So, and actually, funny enough, when I was an undergrad, when I was thinking about, oh, what do I want to do? I had two wonderful political scientist professors who, they were the people who encouraged me to go into academia. I always loved research, but I never thought about being a professor. I thought, oh, all they do is write books. They don't really do anything. We need people who actually want to do, be involved in change. And so I was more thinking that I would go either advocacy or activist route. Then, of course, I ended up going into academia. So being a part of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil has really allowed me to do the type of activist work that fulfills me. And it has just been a wonderful experience to connect with so many activists in Brazil and in the United States. I am always so impressed when I just think about all of the time that both academics and non-academics give to a number of efforts, whether that is, trying to work on indigenous rights or people working on the Amazon or Black rights. It has been really wonderful for me. And even during the pandemic, throughout the pandemic, I've been able to be engaged with people, and then just seeing the level of commitment from Brazilian activists, as well as activists here in the United States, has really just shown me the strength and commitment of people. And that is due to being involved in the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. So it has really been just a wonderful experience for me.
And I must confess, it's been such a pleasure working with you as the national co-coordinator. It's been really a wonderful journey that we've taken together. So thank you so much for all your work. Anything else you wanted to share with us before we end the program?
No, I guess I would just say thank you again for having me on this program. And I encourage people, to continue living Marielle Franco's legacy through all the work that we do, whether you are an academic or a non-academic. I think we should all strive for freedom. It's really what she was fighting for. Freedom for all people, but especially Black people, Black women, youth, and for us to always pay attention to what is going on in Brazil, because it's always whatever is going on in Brazil is going on in the US, but normally it's just at an increased level in Brazil. So even if we think about issues of police brutality, we cannot talk about police brutality and execution of Black people in the US without talking about Brazil. It's just impossible when you look at the numbers. We have to always remember that these are transnational issues. And like I said, continue living out her legacy.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us today on Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington, Brazil office. If you missed our live broadcasts of Dialogues for Democracy, where experts discuss future electoral scenarios regarding the 22 Brazilian elections, please check out the video of the event, which is available on this channel. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you've not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, please leave a 5-star review to help other people find the program. Until next time, até a próxima.